Hello there and welcome to New Day Church, to our virtual service online. Today we're coming to you from outdoors on the banks of the Alafai River. Beautiful, picturesque setting here as we begin a brand new series. I want to start this way. Let me give you a little bit of a word association. You know, if I were to say dog, you might respond how? You might say cat, right? Okay, dog. How about up? How many of you said down? Right? Word association. Okay, what if I were to say this word, Jonah? You're probably thinking about a whale, aren't you? Or a great big fish, yes? Today I'm beginning a new 5-week series that I'm calling Am Jonah, based on this unusual and fascinating Bible story, and a story that is so fitting and apropos for the times we're living in right now. You will love how this book speaks to us in what's going on in our 21st century. And by the way, there's so much more to Jonah's story than the part about him being swallowed by this giant fish. In fact, did you know that actually only 3 out of the 48 verses in the book of Jonah talk about that incident? There's so much more to this story. Now, many people say that Jonah's tale is just that, a tale, a fable, or make-believe, an allegory. But I don't believe that. And primarily I don't believe it because of what Jonah said about what Jesus said about Jonah. Listen to these words from Jesus. As Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So in Jesus' mind, Jonah is an actual historical figure, who, by the way, grew up in a small town located just about 4 miles north of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. And Jonah was kind of a big deal around the country, too. In fact, in 2 Kings 14, it speaks about a prophecy concerning Israel being saved from their enemy, the Assyrians, by the hand of their king. Listen to these words. For the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was bitter, and there was none to help Israel. But God made it clear that He would not blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, so He saved them by the hand of their king, Jeroboam. Now, Jonah was the one that delivered this particular news, this prophecy, to his people. So he earned quite a reputation, a benevolent reputation, and became quite a big deal in the eyes of Israel. And incidentally, the Jewish culture still recognizes the importance of Jonah during their most important holiday of the year, which is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. During that time, during the afternoon service, the book of Jonah is read in its entirety, as well as this passage I just read to you from 2 Kings. And after the reading, the congregation responds with the words, "We are Jonah," which is where the name of this series comes from. Because the Jewish people are right. You are Jonah. I am Jonah. And by the way, much of my content and inspiration for this series comes from the teaching of several preachers, including Darrell Dash and J.D. Myers. I'm really thankful for the sermons of these great young communicators. So let's get started today by talking about this. What happens when God speaks to us? And by the way, He does still speak today. Listen to how Jonah's story begins. The very first verse says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai," which means God spoke to him. The word of the Lord came. That means God spoke to Jonah. We don't know what it was. We don't know if he spoke audibly or it was a whisper in his spirit, but however it happened, obviously Jonah heard it. But after hearing God speak, what did Jonah do? Or to personalize it, what do we do? After God speaks to us, when He speaks into our spirit, how do we respond? Let me give you 3 things today. First of all, when God speaks to us, we will not always like what we hear. Because sometimes He'll ask us to do things we don't necessarily want to do or feel comfortable with, at least initially. Now I want you to watch this. In verse 2 it says, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for the city of Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish in order to flee from the Lord. Now, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And for Jonah, who was a prophet of God, it should have been a no-brainer to go and to preach to people. After all, this is kind of what he does. It's his calling, right? He's a prophet. But Jonah refused to obey God, and he ran away. So what's up with that? Well, in Jonah's defense here, Nineveh was not exactly a cush assignment. It wasn't like being at the best place in the world. This was the capital of the Syrian Empire. And the Syrians were a hellish and brutal and vile people. They were completely void of mercy. They massacred their enemies, and then they mutilated all their captives by dismembering them and decapitating them, burning people alive, that sort of thing. They were so monstrous that when it was rumored that they were going to invade a town, sometimes the entire population of that town would commit suicide just so they would not have to die under Syrian torture. And then, when the bloodshed was over, the Syrians would take the skulls of the beheaded and pile them into pyramids at the city limits as a way to say to all the passerbys, "We rule this world." I mean, it's no wonder Jonah didn't want to go there. Can you blame him? Because I'm sure in his mind's eye, they were not worthy of God's love. They weren't worthy of God's attention. And they were certainly not worthy of God's forgiveness. So no way did Jonah want to go preach to them. Now let's apply that to ourselves. Because there may very well be times when we, like Jonah, hear from God and we don't really like what we hear and or don't want to do what He says. Maybe maybe someone has wronged you and hurt you, or hurt someone that you love. And God's word to you is forgiveness. That's a hard one, right? Lord, no, they don't deserve to be forgiven. They're not sorry. I'm not ready. I don't want to do this. I can't do this. Or maybe you're in a relationship and it's not the best thing you've ever done because the person that you're in relationship with is not good for you. They're rather toxic. They drag you away from the things of God. They make you feel bad more than they make you feel good. And you argue with yourself and God. Oh, but God, He's so purty and He smells so good. Or, but Lord, I'm in love with her and I just want her so bad. I want this relationship. So you run like crazy away from God to get what you want. And granted, God's patient with us. His will is a process. That is a process accomplished over time. We get that. However, when He speaks or whispers into your spirit about His will for you, that's what we call a now moment. In that He knows the timing is good now when He's speaking to you. And that He has everything set in place for you now to make your leap of faith now. You see, here's the deal. While our delay is not necessarily a denial, it is a sign of spiritual immaturity at best, a lack of spiritual growth. I like what Pastor Erwin McManus says about the marks of maturity. He calls it lag time. He says that we can get a handle on whether we are in spiritual mature by observing the amount of time between when God speaks to us and when we obey, the time in between. If the time is short in between, that's a sign of maturity. If the time is long in between, it's a sign of immaturity. So the question is, what's your lag time? When God speaks to you, what is your lag time? The answer may tell you whether you, like Jonah, are running from God or to God. So when God speaks, you will not always like what you hear. And second, when God speaks, there will always be a boat. Verse 3 says, "But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he boarded a ship, a boat, bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord." Now think about this. God told Jonah to go east to Nineveh, but instead he went in the exact opposite direction. In fact, the boat was bound for a Spanish fishing village of Tarshish, which was the westernmost town in the known world at the time. To reach it would require like a year-and-a-half journey. It was literally as far as Jonah could go in the opposite direction away from God. So here's a question. Do you think it was a coincidence that there just happened to be a boat there? A boat headed in that direction at that time? Maybe, but I don't think so. Because listen, the devil always tries to make it easy for us to disobey God. I mean, if you want to run from God, guess what? You're going to have plenty of opportunities. There will always be a boat, which is why it's so vital and imperative to know who you are in Christ and the fact that you have Him and His power at work in you. That's why John said, "You, dear children, are from God and that have overcome the enemy, because the one who is in you is greater than the enemy who is in the world." By the way, how many of you know that God has a boat too? It's more of a luxury liner that will always be anchored right next to that stinking old rowboat of the enemy. And God's boat, God's will for you, is always the best and safest and most blessing-filled place we can possibly be. So when God speaks, you'll not always like what you hear. There will always be a boat. And last, there will always be a reason. And in Jonah's case, there were actually several reasons. But for time's sake, let me call your attention to this one. God spoke to Jonah, and He will speak to us in order that we might show His grace to other people. Even when we're reluctant at first, like Jonah was. Because Jonah was like, "God, Nineveh? You're kidding. Nineveh's filled with terrorists. They're fanatics who kill innocent women and children and threaten the stability of the world." Sounds like a current event today, doesn't it? Nineveh is ruled by a madman who takes the phrase mass destruction to a new level. Nineveh is loaded with people who worship a different God, and they hate you, God. You're the one true God. They should be forgiven. They should get a second chance. They should receive your grace and mercy. No way, God. But now, before we point the finger at Jonah, I wonder, are there times when we respond as he responded? And are there certain individuals, for instance, or people groups, that if the truth be known, we don't really think they're deserving of a second chance? Like, say, ISIS-K or the Taliban? Or let's just make it personal. How about your ex? I'll wait. Waiting. Or that parent who failed you. Or the person who slandered you. The one who mistreated you. How about someone of a different race or ethnicity or sexuality? Should they receive the same grace that you and I receive? Or do you think God should treat you differently than them when it comes to His grace? And maybe not you, but haven't you run across this mindset or this way of thinking before? But Pastor, what if some of those people you mentioned are not so great? And that could be. But guess what? My response must still be one of grace and mercy. So here's a crucial question for you. Are you ready? Are you in love with a God of grace in such a way that makes you a person of grace? You see, it's a frightening thing that Christianity can degenerate into something that's so self-righteous and judgmental, especially when the core message of our faith is unconditional love and forgiveness. Jesus reminded His disciples of this when He said to them, "By this shall those around you know that you follow me, if you have love for one another." And that one another has no boundaries, does it? It simply put, it means whomever God places in our life, we are to love and encourage and, yes, even possibly forgive. And no, that won't always be easy. No, that won't always be convenient. But if we truly are Jesus people, it will eventually happen. By the way, before we leave this, let me show you something interesting I discovered in my study time. I want you to look again at verse 2, if you've got a Bible open there. This phrase is the key to understanding the entire story of the book of Jonah. It says there, "For their wickedness has come up before me." God speaking. When you read that, do you get the impression that God is angry with the Ninevites? Because I sure do. I mean, why wouldn't He be? After all, they're a bunch of bloodthirsty, ruthless killers who tortured people for fun and even blasphemed Him, the God of Israel. Of course God is angry with them. At least Jonah sure believed that. However, many Hebrew scholars today have translated this phrase, "for their wickedness has come up before me," a different way. Contemporary scholarship suggests that a better way to translate this passage is this way: "For their trouble is of concern to me." Now understood this way, that simply means God doesn't view the Ninevites as objects of wrath or people needing to be punished. Rather, God views the Ninevites as people who have gone far astray, people who are in deep trouble, people who are teetering on the verge of self-destruction. And because of that, God is concerned about them. Now, isn't that something? We find the same idea in Luke chapter 19, where Jesus said, "I have come to seek and save after the lost and see them saved." As illogical and, impossible as it seems, God is concerned for and seeking to save even the evil, godless Ninevites. Now, that holds true for you and me, that truth. God is there not to condemn us, but to rescue us, not to judge us, but to save and restore us. And for every person we know and every person we will meet this week, that same thing will be true for them, no matter how little we may think of them or how much we dislike them. Which is why it's so imperative for us to show them the grace and unconditional love of our Father. Let's be God's grace givers this week to whomever God places in your pathway. Some of you may remember reading about or hearing about this story that happened back in 2004. It's about a young couple who were studying for ministry at the seminary when they felt like God spoke to them. Their pastor recounted this story by saying that David and Nikki came to my office to tell me that they believed God wanted them to go to the turbulent and dangerous country of Iraq. You remember back what was going on in 2004. In fact, this was just after the invasion of Iraq, when things were still very, very dangerous. He went on, they knew how dangerous their mission would be, but they also believed that God, now listen, that God had spoken to them. Well, not long after that, the pastor and the world heard the news of some American missionaries who had been attacked in Iraq. That day, David and Nikki had been out surveying refugee camps, and they were in a hurry to reach home before dark. So as they drove through a crowded street, things became eerily quiet. And then suddenly an explosion of bullets and shrapnel ripped into the car in which they were riding. In the aftermath, David was killed. Nikki survived but was severely injured. All this happened in the Iraqi city of Mosul, which interestingly is the ancient site of Nineveh. Nikki, in the book she would later write, spoke of an email that David sent to her in which he spoke of his struggle to obey God. I certainly have plenty of questions, but I'm confident that God has all the answers. So until we meet and all is revealed, I will keep running the race and keep pressing toward the goal. Now, isn't that something? So tragic, yet so beautiful. Now, for most of you watching this, when God speaks to you, it will not be about something that is so ominous or dangerous as what Nikki and David experienced, though it may be. But regardless, the question remains, when God does speak, let's say about your lifestyle, or your marriage, your relationships, your finances, whatever, or how to show grace to those who are not easy to love. When He speaks that way, the question is, will you run from His voice, or will you run to His voice? I think that's a great question for all of us to ponder this week. Why don't we do just that until we get together again? I'll see you soon. God bless you. Have a great week.